I always say that zombies weren't heavyweight freight material like vampires or werewolves until we made them flesh eaters. I saw all the horror films. In fact, I saw every movie just about that came into town. We had 3 movie theaters and a lot of matinees and double features, and I saw them all. The movies changed twice a week in all 3 theaters, so that's a lot of movies. But when I saw zombie movies, they just weren't scary. The zombies just kind of shambled around, threw somebody against a wall, strangled them or tried to, and that was it. But when we made them flesh eaters, then we kind of inadvertently combined the werewolf and the vampire, or the vampire myths, with the zombie myth, and that struck a chord in people. So that's what made it work. But that was my idea. You know, George had written part of the story, the screenplay that was to be, was in story form, not screenplay form. And he had people being attacked and whatever, the girl in the cemetery, and I said, well, but who are these people? Who's doing the attacking? You never say. And he said he didn't know. I said, well, it seems to me they could be dead people. He said, that's good. And I said, but what are they after? You don't say that either. And he said, I don't know. So I said, well, why don't we use my flesh-eating idea? Because I was working on a script about aliens come to Earth in search of human flesh, but they would kill people, and then they would put them in under the ground in like a hotbed under a plate of glass, just like you do with hothouse tomatoes, and they'd let them get suitably rotten before they could eat. So that's what I was working on. So we just made and we didn't call them zombies, we called them ghouls, because not all zombies are ghouls, you know. I mean, a ghoul is somebody that eats dead flesh, hangs around cemeteries and funeral homes, but zombies don't necessarily do that. Well, I think all of us who made Night of the Living Dead deserve to capitalize on it. I mean, who else should? And basically, I mean, George Romero and I ended up with the screenplay rights, and we only gave Image 10 Inc. the right to make one movie, and that's all they wanted to do. They voted unanimously to just make one movie, and that's it. I think a lot of the shareholders were afraid that we might take the money and make some movie they didn't approve of, so they were all too happy to vote unanimously against making another movie, but then that left me and George with the full rights to the screenplay. Well, first of all, we don't call it a sequel because several years after we wrote Return of the Living Dead, by we, I mean me and Russ Streiner and Rudy Ritchie, we wrote it together. And but some years later, then George Romero got his Dawn of the Dead distributed by United Film, and he really needed to be able to call it a sequel. So I helped him get that deal through, and gave him the right to call his picture a sequel, and he gave me the right to pursue Return of the Living Dead, but not to call it a sequel. So it formally is not a sequel. It was written first as a screenplay, and we wrote that around 1972. We just thought that there needed to be a follow-up to Night of the Living Dead because it was successful and because it's a good property and the story's good. So we bashed some ideas around and then delegated Rudy to do the first draft, which he did. I did then subsequently a couple more drafts because people wanted changes and they wanted to take it back to straight horror, where his version was kind of flippant. He used a lot of my ideas, but he used them in a flippant way. And but we had a raiding party in there. We had guys that were on the loose, victimizing people, taking advantage of the crisis situation like people will. And George's script was basically, it was very claustrophobic. It was about a guy and a woman and living in a crawl space in a mall. And they either had a baby or she was going to have a baby. I don't remember which, but we read each other's screenplays. And it caused George, I think, to open his up and turn it into what became Dawn of the Dead. And instead of a raiding party, it was a SWAT team, but had the same cavalier attitude about gunning down ghouls and so on as our raiding party had. So then that made it hard to sell ours. George and I both did the scripts around the same time because we read each other's scripts at the same time. I mean, we traded scripts, and it was early 70s, and in fact, Sam Sherman had, from Independent International Pictures, by that time he had distributed a film we made called The Booby Hatch. I mean, I made it, not George. And so Sam, Independent International, and Sam Sherman and Dan Kennis were partners there, and they wanted us to pull together and make some kind of sequel, so that's why we read each other's scripts. We were talking about just doing one of them together. After all, we shared rights in the thing, and my viewpoint was, why shouldn't we just collaborate one more time in spite of whatever differences we may have, which we didn't have a lot of differences at that point, but we had separate companies and separate partners at that right then, so but it made sense to take this valuable property and all profit off of it instead of being stubborn and selfish. So that was always my viewpoint. Our original story, I always like to mess around with religion, or things that I think really would happen if such a phenomenon took place, and how people really would behave. And there would be people taking advantage of it and raping and pillaging and whatever. So we had that element. But also, if the dead came back to life en masse, the way we portrayed in Night of the Living Dead, religious cults would spring up. And so our script started with, and it was my idea. Basically, most of the ideas in the script were mine, but Rudy was delegated to do the first draft. And one of the ideas was, opens with a funeral. There's a dead child in farming country, and the child's laid out in the living room of the home like people usually did. And during the prayers, the preacher hands the father a mallet and a spike, and he has to drive the spike into his own child's head. So you see right away, pretty shockingly, that this religious group believes that the dead still have to be burned or spiked. And then there's a big bus crash, and a lot of people get killed, and these cult people go and try to spike them, and the sheriff and police arrive and stop them. And then the dead bodies are taken to the morgue, where the only ones that don't come back to life are the ones that have been spiked. But it's not that simple. There's intervening scenes and different things suspense things that happen. So then now you have people in the countryside being threatened by zombies are back, but they're also back in the town where the morgue is and in the funeral homes and all that. And then the raiding party shows up. The other thing that I said right away, we got to get these people out of this house, because if we don't, it's going to be too much like the first film. So there has to be mobility to it, and so the people are attacked at the house, and then the raiding party shows up and saves them, but except they're out of the frying pan into the fire and don't know it at first. Plus, one of the girls is pregnant and she gets bitten. And the last scene is her having the baby, but you don't know what that baby's going to be if it's born to a ghoul-bitten mother. Around 1978, I had novelized our script, so the first Return of the Living Dead novel was straight horror. People loved the novel. They printed 50,000. Dell Books, a small company, they printed 50,000 copies in 1978, and they sold out completely. So it's been unavailable till now, when Kensington Books has done it, and again, it's selling real well. And every convention, the fans come up and tell me how much they like it, and they'll say this should have been made. We eventually just sold the script outright to Tom Fox, because every attempt to raise money had failed for one reason or another. And at one point I was supposed to direct it, at another point I brought Tobe Hooper into it, and it just kept going. I mean, there are ads that ran in Variety and other places with me as the director, and some guy I never heard of as a writer. So apparently Tom thought he would get this guy to rewrite our script. For some reason, it didn't get financed, and we sold the script. Well, then Tom Fox got the Orion and Hemdale deal, and they said, horror's dead. Can't do straight horror, and now it's back. They want comedy. So they hired, after a number of gyrations and years that went into it, they hired Dan O'Bannon to put the comedy into it. Then I novelized his script. By that time, Day of the Dead was shot, and it was coming out. So now we had both pictures coming out at the same time. So I said, well, why don't we use our heads here? Instead of fighting both pictures coming out at the same time and fighting each other, let's stagger the release schedules so both pictures can make a profit. So Richard Rubenstein, or whoever, I think Richard, was stubborn. You know, oh, we're going to have a big hit and you're going to have a flop, so why should we make any kind of deal like that? And they caused me a lot of grief. And then their picture came out and flopped, and ours came out and became a big success. So. Oh boy, every now and then the assholes get their comeuppance. Well, George and I were on the phone during all this, both thinking that everybody else should be gentlemanly and do the right thing, but then they didn't. So, I mean, it's a myth that George and I ended up enemies because we didn't. Even when I left that company, they offered me more money to stay, but I didn't like the way things were going. And but we never argued, fought, or anything like that. I saw Return of the Living Dead because I novelized Dan O'Bannon's script. I liked what he did with it. When I read the script, I didn't think it would be successful because it looked like he was trying to do too much on low money. But I think he got more money than originally was expected, and because of the partnership with Orion and Hemdale, and so he pulled the stuff off. You know, the stuff about all the water leaking into the graves and all that. He was able. I thought that it's going to be hard pulling that off if you only have $750,000 or so, but I think he ended up with more money than that. And then I think Tony Gardner did those special effects, and he did a good job. So, and I saw part 2, and then I haven't seen any of the others, which I hear are just getting fuzzier and fuzzier, becoming fuzzier and fuzzier carbon copies, and not very good. It's become a pretty generic phrase, Living Dead. Nobody really owns any particular rights to that phrase, Living Dead, and so you had Spanish pictures being retitled, This of the Living Dead, That of the Living Dead, Birdcage of the Living Dead, whatever. And so nobody has a patent or a copyright or anything else on those words. What happens, though, is when we sold Return of the Living Dead to Tom Fox, then we had to agree for 10 years not to use the phrase Living Dead in another picture. But that 10 years is long expired. It's very gratifying to have done something that inspired so many things and has become like an icon and a phenomenon in our culture and all that stuff. We get a laugh out of it. And it's, and our careers continue, and I've come back to it several times, and I've got probably 4 or 5 different scripts that deal with zombies right now, and they're all good in a different way. So who knows if I'll get the money to make them. The Escape of the Living Dead came out as a comic book, made the top 10 nationally, and we got a deal with Stonebrook Entertainment, and the first thing they did was got these actors to start giving me script notes. And if it was made their way, it would turn out to be like zombie hookers in Hollywood or something, which it isn't, but then they think they know something. So it's a crazy business.